How's it, buggers? So, fear. We're going to go over today how to conquer any fear in the world. Now, that sounds like a big promise, but it's really not that impressive once you actually break it down. So, let's do that. I've seen videos and I've read stories about very experienced skydivers forgetting to pull their parachutes. Now, the initial reaction when you hear that or you think about that, you probably got to think, what a fucking idiot. Like, that's like the most important thing to possibly remember if you're skydiving is to like pull your chute. How could you possibly forget, first of all? And second of all, how could someone who's so experienced forget? Because surely the experience makes you like super good at skydiving. It does, right? But it also does something else, which is kind of a problem when there's real danger involved, but is super useful if there's not real danger involved, because it can help people like you and me overcome lifelong crippling fears towards things. So, why do experienced skydivers forget to open their parachutes after doing thousands of jumps out of planes and landing safely? Basically, your mind has a way of processing and recovering from past trauma. And usually, fear in most cases is based off of past trauma and your idea of self. Right? So, having fear that is present in a real situation, like in skydiving, where it's like your life is actually at stake and you're actually in danger, right? Having fear in a situation like that makes a lot of sense, right? You should. But if you've done it enough, that fear goes away. And it's not because of desensitization, it's actually because of letting go. And that's a huge difference, right? I want to hammer home on that, right? Because people in the self-improvement space focus a lot on trying to desensitize yourself to something by repeated, exposure. And by doing that, like all the time, you see like social anxiety challenges and all of this stuff where it's like, go and talk to 100 girls to get over your fear of rejection. Now, if you go about it with the right mentality, I think that's actually a fantastic thing to do, right? But if you go about it, with the sort of wrong idea, then you actually just reinforce, you reinforce this thing as like a scary negative thing, right? So it does really matter the state of mind that you're in when you decide to do something like that. So when it comes to skydiving, having fear is a very normal and a very healthy response, right? But there's two things that mainly lead to these skydivers who just forget to pull their chutes, and this is my theory about it, but I think it makes a lot of sense. First of all, is repetitive exposure to the situation that causes the fear response in the first place. And secondly, no way of distracting yourself or trying to force the emotion to go away by suppressing or repressing or whatever in the situation, right? So those two things, let me just be clear. First of all, repeated exposure to a situation that triggers or provokes fear. And second of all, not having a way to distract yourself. And the reason that second one is really important is because all of this comes down to like a concept that I'm calling TIF, right? Which is time in fear. And this is basically your brain and your body's natural way of like recovering from trauma. And what it is basically the willingness to sit with an emotion without trying to force it to go away, or without distracting yourself from it by using an external stimulus to remove your attention, right, and take your attention somewhere else. Now, the reason that people don't just do this naturally is mainly because of the time that we live in these days, right? Like, we have so many distractions on hand, and, big companies are, sitting and just waiting to take advantage of like the tiniest amount of discomfort that you want to avoid, right? So the reason, and I mean, there's many reasons, but one, very important reason that mental health is just getting worse and worse as time goes on, despite the fact that our technology is getting better, poverty is dropping, all kinds of good things are happening, but mental health is like in the fucking gutters. And the reason is because, technology has changed our relationship to our emotions. It's made us have an automatic, constant distraction machine that we carry with us everywhere. And so this natural process of sitting with your emotion to allow it to come up, and then it processes and then it leaves, right? This natural process has been like severely hindered and interrupted by the constant stream of distraction that we have around us all the time. So you may hear this and it may be like a frustrating answer, or it may be like quite a scary answer, but I'm going to help you deal with both of those sort of reactions by trying to but by explaining some more about this actual method, so that you can see it doesn't mean that you just have to dive headfirst into something that you find, 17 out of 10 level scary, and just like sit there and just like fucking like freak out or whatever. You don't have to do that, right? The thing that we're aiming for is exposure to fear without distraction and without rejecting the fear itself. Now, I know this sounds like a bit hokey pokey and shit, but just bear with me for a little bit, right? The reason that trauma remains for a long time in most people's lives is because we hate feeling certain emotions, and we dub certain emotions as negative and as horrible or evil, and we dub certain emotions as good and acceptable. What that leads to is holding on very tightly to the negative emotion, right? So let's say you go to a family event and something that a relative says really just like triggers the shit out of you, right? What do we usually do? For me, personally, when that's happened, I'll go home, and only after paying a lot of attention do I realize that this is why I've done this in the past. If someone made me really angry, right, like angry to the point where it's like something is getting triggered, it's like not a really accurate response to like the situation, but I'm getting really triggered, right? I would go home, and as soon as humanly possible, I would open my phone or open my laptop or whatever, and I would just binge YouTube for like 6 hours or something, like genuinely for like an ungodly length of time. I would distract myself so hard, and it would basically force my mind to just take all of this emotion that I was feeling and just like push it down and just like push it down and push it down and like get rid of it. Right? But it doesn't actually go away. Your mind just stores it, subconsciously, where it still affects you, and it still kind of runs your life, but you don't consciously feel it, right? So that's what most people do, is we find things, and as soon as we have an uncomfortable or an unacceptable emotion, we just like stuff it down or distract ourselves from it like super hardcore. And you might be saying like, oh no, I don't think I really do that. Pay attention a lot to your emotions, right? And you will see how often you do it. Because if it's not something that you've specifically paid attention to before, it'll be like, yeah, not very noticeable, because your mind also distracts you, or you distract yourself from the fact that you're trying to run away from something as well, because that in itself is uncomfortable to think about. And so it also ends up getting distracted from and pushed away, right? So what you need to do is build a skill, and you don't have to go crazy in the beginning, right? You can take it at your own pace. You can still push yourself, but understand that you're under no obligation to actually follow through on the action that you decide on. Because the important thing is just bringing the fear up to the surface and then experiencing it without judgment. And by doing that, you process a lot of stuff. And it's not going to be like some kind of nebulous 5 years from now, maybe it'll be a little bit better by then. It's very effective very quickly. And I can tell you about an experience I had by doing this with like a social anxiety challenge, but not in the typical sense, that I spoke about earlier, where it's like you just desensitize yourself by forcing yourself to go through like, really like intense amounts of like negative emotion that truthfully you're not very ready to experience, right? So the way that you actually do this is just by showing up and trying. And that's all you have to do. You show up and you try. And if you back out, that's fine. And you're going to be like, Matt, why is that fine, right? Haven't you failed if you back out? No, you haven't failed. All that's happened is that you've experienced an amount of fear that is too overwhelming for your current like situation. So you've allowed some of it to come up. You've tried your best to allow it to kind of sit there, right? But maybe it was a bit too intense and then you distracted yourself from it again, right? But that, even though that is what leads to having like, long-term trauma that doesn't go away, it is also a useful system because it allows you to continue on despite having experienced incredibly difficult or scary or sad things, right? And it just gives you time, basically, until you decide that you're ready, and then you can heal from it. So all you have to do is show up and try and rack up as many minutes in fear as you can, right? So like the goal isn't to try and push through. The goal isn't to try and like, brute force your way through it. Literally rack up minutes in fear. And that's all you have to do, right? I had an experience with this by doing a social anxiety challenge, but by doing it, within the frame of mind that I'm talking about now, by not trying to push through anxiety, by not forcing myself to follow through if I feel just too afraid to, or I really don't want to. It still works, right? The process still works because it's the time in fear that really matters, right? It's like racking those minutes up where you allow the emotion to come up, like, the sort of the more intense emotions maybe than usual, you allow them to come up and you just spend time there. And what happens is that you have like a gas tank of suppressed like negative emotion that is causing you to be so triggered by things where there is no real danger, right? So if you think about like talking to a random stranger, it's like your life is almost definitely not on the line, but it can feel like that. It can feel like, there's many times where I personally have seen like pretty girls that I want to talk to, right? Girls I just want to go introduce myself to, maybe try and get their numbers, whatever, where I backed out because it literally becomes so scary. It's like, holy fuck, no, I can't do that, right? But there's no actual danger. So what it is, that reaction, right, that's disproportionate to reality, it's a gas tank of accumulated negative emotion that you haven't processed yet, that is getting sort of poked up and brought to the surface by the situation itself, right? It's forcing you to confront something about yourself or about your sort of living situation or whatever it is that you find very uncomfortable. But again, that's all you need to do. You just need to allow yourself to be triggered and then spend as many minutes as you can kind of handle, like sitting with that emotion and just allowing it to be there, right? Because this gas tank is finite, right? There's not an infinite amount of fear sitting there, right? It actually has like a finite end. And one of the most interesting and like, revolutionary experiences I've ever had was when I actually found for the first time the end of a gas tank after spending enough time in fear in a specific situation to have like a revolutionary experience, right? So what I did is I went into a mall and I held a sign that said free hugs, right? More accurately, what I did the first time I tried this was I actually went to the mall and I walked around with the sign in my pocket for an hour, right? And that whole time, it was just racking up minutes in fear, right? That whole time, that's all I was doing. I did end up backing out and going home. Like, if I tried to take the paper out of my pocket, I got like panicky and like super scared, right? So then it felt like too much, and I was like, I'll go home and I'm going to try again, right? The thing is, it's so easy to feel discouraged when something like this happens, where it's like, I had this, I really tried hard, I put in so much effort, like it took a lot of energy for me to like allow myself to experience this much discomfort, and I don't feel any closer to my goal, right? But the thing is, that's massive progress. The reason is because the gas tank feels like it's full until you empty it. It feels like it's going to go on forever until there's literally a moment where all of a sudden it just kind of all evaporates, and whatever you're about to do instantaneously becomes effortless. And that's what happened for me when I did it myself. So I had the first try when I went to the mall, walked around for like half an hour, a full hour, like walked around for a full hour, maybe even a bit longer than that. Basically just experiencing small amounts of fear. I was just allowing myself to experience small amounts of fear. I would try and take the thing out of my pocket, the little like paper sign that I made, and it would, trigger more fear that would come up, and it would be a bit too intense, so I'd put the paper away, or I would like literally move my hand away from my pocket so I know that I'm not going to take it out. And then the fear would kind of like, the level would come down, but there was like this idle level that was there the whole time. And that was actually the critical like part, right? Is that idle level. And so what happened is that I went to the mall again, right? A week later, it did tire me out quite a lot the first time, because when you're not used to doing this, it does take effort, right? But it tired me out quite a bit. When I got there, I spent another 40 minutes walking around, allowing fear to just come up, right? But I was noticeably less triggered than the first time I did this, because now I could actually take the sign out of my pocket and I could just hold it by my side. Now I know that doesn't really sound impressive or like progress, but it was pretty big progress, right? Because it wasn't me forcing myself through any anxiety. It's just that there wasn't any more anxiety being triggered by this action, right, of holding the sign outside of my pocket. And again, I walked around essentially procrastinating, but not really procrastinating, doing this specific action of standing and opening the sign and holding it, right? But again, that whole time, all I was actually doing, the actual goal, was to rack up time in fear. And then what happened after 45 minutes-ish of doing this, right? Like, I had decided to sit down at a bench in the middle of like a sort of busy walkway in the mall, right? I sat down on this bench. I took the paper out, and I was still quite scared, but a lot less than I was the first time, and a lot less than I was earlier in that day, right? So I just sat with the paper there, unfolded, And I just put it on my lap and I just looked at it for a while, right? And I just had it there. And again, it's bringing up more like fear, right? It's triggering a lot of fear. But again, I was just sitting there racking up minutes in fear, right? Time in fear. And all of a sudden, after about 5 or 10 minutes of sitting there with the sign, it seemed as if all of the triggeredness just evaporated. It literally was like a transition of like in 15 or 20 seconds, I had gone from feeling like super stifled, super kind of on edge, and it just literally like melted away. And all of a sudden, like I could just stand up and open the sign and walk to the middle of the room, or the middle of the hallway thingy that I was in, and just stand there with it and be perfectly fine. I stood there and like, you can still feel like, you can feel kind of like the physical effects of fear, like, maybe your hands are a bit shaky or whatever it is. But the actual mental side of it was completely effortless. Like all of a sudden, this like sort of tank of fear that I had accumulated over many years of like distraction and repression and suppression and all of that, I had all of a sudden, for this specific like encounter or this specific situation, I had emptied that tank, right? I had processed a whole bunch of stuff, all the things that were making me very scared to do this action in the first place. And all of a sudden, it was just effortless. It was like I had become enlightened on the spot. And the reason that this is the superior way to deal with negative emotions when compared to like trying to just desensitize yourself is that this is permanent. I can feel a very stark difference about the way that I conduct myself in public in general now. And with desensitization, you have to go back and you have to keep doing it. Otherwise, you'll eventually get back to your baseline, right? So like if you don't keep pushing yourself all the time, you'll eventually just slip back to exactly how you felt before. And the reason I'm saying that is because that's what I used to do, and that's what happened to me when I used to do it. I would like brute force my way through anxiety and force myself to talk to girls at the gym, right? Like super like brutal in a way towards myself. I would do that. And my fear never lessened. I had to like fight this like fear of death every single time to try and talk to someone, right? And by doing this method that I'm talking about now, it's definitely not, I didn't come up with it, right? It's things that I've learned from books and things that I've learned from just trying stuff. But this method of just spending time in the fear, right? And, maybe it'll take multiple attempts to get to the point where you can do the thing that you were, trying to do. But in the beginning is when you deal with the worst of it, right? Because in the beginning, that fuel tank is the most packed full of like trauma, basically, that you have to allow to come up. It's like, so now if I want to go to the mall and I want to do that again, like I'm not scared to like hold the piece of paper up. Like I can imagine it. I can imagine doing it and it doesn't elicit fear within me at all, right? Whereas before it scared the absolute shit out of me. So it's like this is like a permanent positive change when it comes to overcoming a fear. That all you have to do is spend time microdosing bits of the fear, right? Like moving towards the goal, the thing that you want to do, and even stopping short, taking a week break, come back, and then carry on, right? Like expose yourself a little bit more to the fear and just allow it to be there. That's all you have to do, right? It's the act of not doing that takes you so far with this method, right? So in my opinion, that's how you overcome any fear, right? Is you just have to find the willingness to spend time experiencing some of the intensity that you've been distracting yourself from and avoiding all this time. And by doing that, you allow your brain's natural, powerful, innate ability to heal and to change from a state of fear to a state of courage and a state of acceptance and love, right? So take this and use it where there isn't real danger. That's really important. Don't use this where there is real danger, right? Because it also works when there's real danger and you don't actually want to expose yourself to unnecessary risk, right? So take this, use it responsibly for things like learning to talk to strangers, learning to, go out there on your own and try something that might fail. And I promise you, this will give you fantastic results as soon as you learn that it works for yourself once. As soon as you've done it once and it's worked for you once, your whole life will change. My whole life changed. So yeah, anyway, hope that's good for you guys. I'll check you buggers later. And fuck off and go meditate and shit.